There is a tree growing in the jungles of Southeast Asia that produces leaves more potent than morphine. Not gram for gram, leaf for leaf. It has been healing humans for over 1,000 years, survived colonial occupation, and in 2024, scientists discovered it does something no synthetic painkiller can replicate, something pharmaceutical companies called impossible. The opioid industry spends billions making sure you never learn its name. In 1831, a Dutch botanist named Peter Willem Korhals stepped into the rainforests of what would become Malaysia. Local workers were chewing leaves during their 12-hour shifts in the tropical heat, leaves that seemed to eliminate their pain while keeping them alert and focused. When Korhals documented the tree, he found laborers who had been working since dawn, still energetic as the sun set, their chronic aches forgotten. This was not caffeine, this was not opium. This was something entirely different. The tree belonged to the coffee family, but its effects defied everything Western medicine understood about pain management. Workers called it kratom, and they had been using it for centuries to heal wounds, fight fevers, and transform grueling manual labor into manageable work. But what Korhals witnessed was just the beginning of a story that would eventually threaten the most profitable industry on Earth. By the early 1900s, kratom had spread beyond the plantations. Entire communities in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia relied on it not just for pain, but as their primary medicine. Mothers used it to treat their children's fevers and coughs. Healers applied it to infected wounds that would otherwise turn deadly. Farmers chewed the leaves to work fields that would have been impossible without some form of relief. This was not recreational use. This was survival. Then something extraordinary happened that revealed kratom's true power. In the 1830s, opium addiction was destroying communities across Southeast Asia. British colonial powers had flooded the region with the drug, creating millions of addicts who spent their life savings chasing their next dose. But in remote villages where kratom grew wild, something different was occurring. People were using the leaves to break free from opium entirely. The withdrawal symptoms that kept addicts trapped disappeared when they switched to kratom. The desperate craving that drove people to steal and sell everything they owned simply vanished. Word spread through the underground networks of those trying to escape opium's grip. Kratom was not just treating pain, it was curing addiction itself. By 1943, this presented a massive problem for the Thai government. They had built their entire revenue system around taxing opium sales. Every addict represented steady income. Every transaction generated government funds. But kratom was growing wild in every forest, and anyone could harvest it for free. As Police Major General Pin Emerwisai told the House of Representatives in January 1943, taxes for opium were high, while kratom was not being taxed at all. With people switching to kratom instead, this was having a visible impact on government income. The solution was simple. On August 3, 1943, Thailand banned kratom entirely with the Kratom Act. Not because it was dangerous, not because it was causing harm, because it was impossible to tax a plant that grew everywhere and was helping people escape the addiction that funded the government. But the plant refused to disappear. For over 80 years, kratom continued growing in the wild while researchers slowly began to understand what made it so unique. In the 1960s, scientists isolated two primary compounds from the leaves, mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. Both attached to the same brain receptors as morphine and heroin, but they did something unprecedented. They provided pain relief without the respiratory depression that kills people during overdoses. Dr. Christopher McCurdy spent decades studying kratom at the University of Florida. His team discovered that while traditional opioids activate a protein called beta-arrestin 2, which causes most of the dangerous side effects, kratom's compounds selectively avoid this pathway. The result was pain relief that worked through opioid receptors, but without the life-threatening complications that make pharmaceutical opioids so deadly. The numbers seemed impossible. 7-hydroxymitragynine was 13 times more potent than morphine for pain relief, but users were not collapsing from respiratory failure. They were not overdosing in parking lots or dying in hospital emergency rooms. Something about kratom's natural chemistry was providing the benefits of opioids while avoiding the dangers that had created the deadliest drug crisis in American history. But this presented another problem. By 2021, an estimated 1.7 million Americans were using kratom according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Most were not recreational users seeking a high. They were people with chronic pain who had been prescribed pharmaceutical opioids and were desperately trying to escape the addiction that followed. Others were construction workers, nurses, and veterans who needed pain relief but had watched opioids destroy their families and communities. A 2020 study from Johns Hopkins University found that 87% of kratom users reported relief from opioid withdrawal symptoms. They were using a plant that grew wild in Southeast Asian forests to break free from synthetic drugs that had been engineered in American laboratories. The same pattern that had emerged in 1830s Malaysia was repeating itself in modern America. People were discovering that nature had already solved the problem that pharmaceutical companies claimed only they could address. This could not be allowed to continue. In 2016, the Drug Enforcement Administration announced plans to classify kratom as a Schedule I controlled substance, the same category as heroin and cocaine. The classification would make kratom illegal to possess, sell, or research. But something unprecedented happened. Over 60 members of Congress signed a letter opposing the ban. Thousands of Americans flooded the DEA with comments describing how kratom had saved their lives, helped them escape prescription opioid addiction, and allowed them to manage chronic pain without the side effects that had made their lives unbearable. The ban was suspended, but the pressure continued. What happened next revealed the true scope of what kratom threatened. The global opioid market reached $14.8 billion in 2023, with companies like Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, and others generating massive profits from addiction itself. Each person who switched to kratom represented lost revenue. Each community that discovered the plant was one fewer market for synthetic alternatives. But kratom had a vulnerability that the industry was about to exploit. The vulnerability was synthetic manipulation. While natural kratom leaves contained dozens of alkaloids working together in what scientists called an entourage effect, laboratories could isolate and concentrate single compounds. They began producing synthetic 7-hydroxymetragenine, the most potent alkaloid in kratom, at concentrations that never existed in nature. These synthetic products were marketed as enhanced kratom, but they bore no resemblance to the plant that had safely served communities for centuries. Natural kratom leaves contained less than 2% 7-hydroxymetragenine. The synthetic versions contained up to 50% or more. Users who had safely consumed kratom for years suddenly found themselves experiencing euphoria, loss of control, and the very addiction patterns that kratom had helped them escape. Emergency rooms began reporting overdoses from products labeled as kratom that contained synthetic compounds manufactured in Chinese laboratories. Headlines screamed about kratom dangers while conveniently ignoring that the victims had consumed artificial chemicals, not the natural plant. The distinction disappeared in media reports. Enhanced kratom, synthetic kratom, and natural kratom became synonymous in public perception. Dr. Oliver Grundmann at the University of Florida warned that synthetic concentrated 7-hydroxymetragenine products were not natural, not organic, and not even kratom. But the damage was accelerating. Every overdose from synthetic products became ammunition for those seeking to ban the natural plant entirely. The same strategy that had been used against cannabis was being deployed against kratom. Flood the market with dangerous synthetic alternatives, then use the resulting harm to justify banning the safe natural version. In July 2024, the FDA announced that synthetic concentrated 7-hydroxymetragenine should be considered for scheduling under the Controlled Substances Act. They emphasized the focus was on synthetic products, not leaf kratom, but industry observers knew this was the first step. Once synthetic versions were banned, the distinction between synthetic and natural would blur until both were prohibited. The timing was not coincidental. Pharmaceutical companies were racing to develop their own kratom-derived medications that could be patented and sold at prescription prices. Johnson & Johnson had filed patents on kratom alkaloids. Other companies were developing synthetic versions of mitragynine that could be manufactured in controlled facilities and sold for hundreds of dollars per dose. The pattern was identical to what had happened with cannabis. Allow synthetic versions to cause harm, ban everything in response, then reintroduce pharmaceutical alternatives at massive markups. K2 and spice had been used to justify continued cannabis prohibition while companies developed synthetic THC medications. Now, synthetic kratom was being used to threaten the natural plant, while pharmaceutical versions moved through development pipelines. But kratom had advantages that cannabis never possessed. The plant was already legal in most states. Millions of Americans had direct experience with its safety and effectiveness. Unlike cannabis, which carried decades of propaganda about gateway drug theories and moral panics, kratom users were predominantly middle-aged adults managing legitimate medical conditions. They were nurses who had injured their backs, construction workers with chronic pain, and veterans suffering from conditions that VA hospitals had failed to treat effectively. These were not stereotypical drug users. They were teachers, police officers, and healthcare workers who had discovered that a plant from Southeast Asia worked better than anything their doctors had prescribed. They had careers, families, and political influence that previous drug policy targets had lacked. The American Kratom Association mobilized this community with unprecedented effectiveness. They organized letter-writing campaigns, lobbied state legislators, and funded research studies that demonstrated kratom's safety profile. When states attempted to ban kratom, users showed up to legislative hearings with their stories of pain relief, addiction recovery, and lives saved. State after state that had initially moved toward prohibition reversed course. Utah, which had banned kratom in 2019, legalized it again in 2021 with regulation and age restrictions. Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia implemented Kratom Consumer Protection Acts that ensured product quality while keeping the plant legal. The momentum that had seemed unstoppable in favor of prohibition began shifting toward regulation and acceptance. This created a new problem for the pharmaceutical industry. Unlike previous drug policy battles that occurred in the shadows of society, the kratom debate was happening in suburban living rooms and congressional offices. The people defending kratom were voters, taxpayers, and campaign contributors. They had medical records documenting failed prescription treatments and personal testimonies of kratom's effectiveness. The industry needed a different strategy. If they could not ban kratom outright, they would control its supply chain. Major supplement companies began acquiring kratom vendors and standardizing products according to pharmaceutical manufacturing practices. Quality control became the justification for corporate consolidation. Small farmers in Indonesia and Malaysia who had supplied kratom for generations found themselves competing against industrial operations that could produce standardized extracts at scale. The same companies that had created the opioid crisis were positioning themselves to control the plant that could solve it. They spoke of safety standards and consumer protection while systematically eliminating the independent suppliers who had made kratom accessible to those who needed it most. But the plant itself remained unchanged. In Indonesian forests, kratom trees continued producing leaves with the same alkaloid profile that had relieved pain for over 1,000 years. In American backyards, people grew their own trees from seeds purchased online. The knowledge of kratom's traditional preparation methods spread through online communities faster than any regulatory agency could track. What the industry failed to understand was that kratom represented something more dangerous than competition. It represented proof that natural alternatives to synthetic drugs were not only possible, but superior. If a tree growing wild in Southeast Asia could outperform laboratory-designed molecules, what did that say about the entire pharmaceutical model of drug development? The implications extended far beyond pain management. If kratom could help people escape opioid addiction without expensive treatment programs, rehabilitation facilities, or ongoing medical supervision, then entire industries built around addiction treatment were unnecessary. The plant threatened not just opioid sales, but the massive infrastructure of addiction medicine that generated billions in revenue from the crisis pharmaceutical companies had created. The kratom story reveals a truth that threatens every assumption about modern medicine. For over 1,000 years, a simple tree has been solving problems that billion-dollar laboratories claim only they can address. It provides pain relief without respiratory depression. It breaks addiction cycles without creating new dependencies. It grows wild in forests, while pharmaceutical patents expire in boardrooms. The choice before us is not whether kratom should be legal or illegal. The choice is whether we will continue believing that synthetic molecules designed for profit are superior to compounds refined by centuries of human experience. Whether we will trust corporate laboratories over traditional knowledge. Whether we will accept that nature's solutions must be banned so artificial alternatives can be sold. Kratom is still legal in most of America today. The plant still grows in Southeast Asian forests. The knowledge of its traditional use still survives in communities that refuse to forget. But the window for preserving this access is closing as synthetic versions flood markets and regulatory agencies prepare responses that could eliminate the natural plant entirely. The tree that could replace synthetic painkillers grows in jungles half a world away. But the choice to protect or destroy it happens in legislative chambers, corporate boardrooms, and individual decisions made by people who understand what they stand to lose. The opioid industry has spent billions making sure you never learned its name. Now you know why they were so afraid you would find out.